Some moments don't shout, they wait in stillness. Arnold Schwarzenegger didn't come to be seen. He came to sit quietly in the front row like any father would. But that morning in Santa Monica, a single request from a security guard threatened to turn presence into conflict. And what followed, it was something no one in that gym would forget. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, don't forget to like and subscribe. The California sun rose over Santa Monica with a golden shimmer that kissed the rooftops and painted long shadows across the school parking lot. Santa Monica High was alive with celebration. Cars pulled in steadily, their doors swinging open as families emerged holding balloons, flowers, and tightly clutched programs. Parents adjusted ties, checked makeup, fixed mortarboards on their children's heads. Laughter echoed across the lot, a soft orchestration of pride and anticipation. Amid the flurry of well-dressed guests and polished shoes, a black GMC pickup rolled into the far corner of the lot. It didn't roar, it simply arrived. The engine cut, the door opened. Arnold Schwarzenegger stepped out. He wore a light gray suit, no tie, no entourage, just a man with square shoulders, slow steps, and a presence that drew attention without asking for it. His face was partly hidden behind dark glasses, but even with years layered across it, there was no mistaking the quiet power in how he moved. One woman, standing with her husband near the registration table, leaned in. "Is that?" she whispered. Her husband squinted. "Looks like him." Arnold didn't respond. He didn't need to. He gave a small nod to the volunteers at the gate, handed over a folded sheet, his printed seating confirmation, and continued walking. The volunteers hesitated for half a breath, then checked the list, stamped the corner, and handed it back with a thank you. He didn't linger. He didn't pose. He walked past lines of guests and through the gymnasium doors into a space humming with color and voices. Blue and silver streamers lined the walls. A banner read, "Congratulations, Class of 2025. Folding chairs stretched in perfect rows across the polished floor. Students gathered near the stage in dark blue gowns, their faces alight with nerves and excitement. Some laughed, some practiced their handshakes, some stood quietly as if waiting for time to catch up. Arnold moved toward the front of the room. A few heads turned as he passed. Some recognized him, others simply sensed something unusual. He took his assigned seat in the front row, third from the left. Not reserved, assigned. There was a difference. He adjusted his jacket, sat down with his back straight, and placed the program in his lap. His eyes scanned the room, not with urgency, not with expectation, but with the calm of someone who had learned long ago to see everything without revealing anything. No one approached, no one greeted him, and that was exactly how he preferred it. To the crowd, he may have looked like the Arnold they'd seen in films, in press conferences, at rallies decades ago. But that man, the celebrity, the governor, the action hero, he hadn't walked into the building today. The man who sat in the front row now was a father, just a father. His son, Christopher Schwarzenegger, was graduating at the top of his class. And Arnold wouldn't have missed this moment for anything. From across the gym, Christopher glanced over. Their eyes met. No wave, no smile, just a nod. Subtle, personal, enough. The room swelled with motion as more families arrived. Ushers guided guests to their seats. Teachers took their places near the stage. A voice on the intercom announced that the ceremony would begin in 15 minutes. The lights dimmed slightly, conversations hushed. Arnold sat still, his hands folded, his breathing even. He didn't fidget. He didn't glance at his phone. He waited, fully present. Outside, balloons floated against the blue sky. Inside, beneath the streamers and the shifting crowd, a quiet line had already been drawn. Today wasn't about Arnold Schwarzenegger, the icon. Today was about Christopher, and a father who came to witness his son's moment. Not to be seen, but to be there. The gymnasium filled slowly, like a tide rolling in. Chairs creaked as guests settled into their places. Programs rustled. A soft orchestral version of Pomp and Circumstance drifted from the speakers, not quite loud enough to command attention, but just enough to remind everyone why they were here. The energy in the room was celebratory, yet focused. This was a day that marked an ending and a beginning, and everyone knew it. Arnold remained still in his seat, third from the left in the front row. He didn't shift, didn't check his watch. His hands rested over the program in his lap, fingers laced together as his eyes quietly scanned the stage. The lights glinted off the polished wood floor, catching on the floral arrangements by the podium. His breathing was even, steady. Present, then he noticed it, a pair of eyes. Across the room, standing by the side entrance, two security guards were watching him. Young, early 30s maybe, one with a buzz cut, arms folded. The other taller, with a neatly groomed beard, speaking softly into a shoulder radio. Their gazes weren't casual, they were fixed. Intent, not aggressive, not yet, but calculated. Arnold didn't move, didn't acknowledge them. He had noticed that kind of stare before, on sets, in meetings, in moments when someone thought they had a decision to make about who belonged where. He kept his eyes on the stage, still, unbothered. The shorter guard leaned slightly toward his partner, murmuring just loud enough that the nearest guests might hear, even if they didn't understand. Unidentified individual in Section A, he said. No visible credentials. Requesting confirmation. His partner nodded and responded in a clipped tone. Copy, standing by. Arnold remained still. Across the room, someone laughed. A child called out to their sibling. The background hum of joy continued uninterrupted, but in that small corridor of silence between rows A and B, something had shifted. It wasn't loud, it wasn't obvious, but it was there. From the corner of his eye, Arnold could feel them still watching, still evaluating, as if waiting for him to give them a reason. He didn't. Instead, with the smoothness of a man accustomed to scrutiny, Arnold reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and gently unfolded the paper he had shown earlier. His thumb pressed lightly on the edge, steadying it. The words printed on the paper were clear, bold. Section A, Row 1, Christopher Schwarzenegger, parent guest. He didn't wave it, didn't raise his voice. He simply held it in his lap in plain sight. The guards didn't move. But their posture tensed. One of them tilted his head toward a supervisor standing farther back. The supervisor glanced over, made a vague motion with two fingers, and looked away. Nothing definitive. Just the kind of gesture people make when they're not sure whether to escalate or ignore. Arnold adjusted his posture, crossing one leg slowly over the other. He looked toward the entrance where the students would soon walk in. Not to avoid the tension, but because he had chosen, deliberately, not to let it define the moment. Across the gym, Christopher was lining up with the rest of the graduates, adjusting the sleeve of his gown. He hadn't seen the guards. Not yet, but Arnold had. And he knew this wasn't over, not yet. The lights dimmed slightly as the announcer's voice echoed through the gym, inviting everyone to find their seats. The rustling of programs slowed. Conversations dropped to murmurs. Families leaned in, phones silenced, eyes turned toward the entrance where the graduates would appear. But in the front row, the stillness around Arnold was about to shift. The two security guards stepped forward. Their shoes tapped softly on the polished floor, moving with a kind of rehearsed authority. One paused just beside Arnold's row. The other leaned down slightly, voice low but firm. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to come with us," he said. "Your name doesn't appear on our verified list for this section." Arnold looked up, not surprised, not offended, just aware. He didn't rise, he didn't flinch. His voice was calm, almost quiet. "This seat was assigned," he said, unfolding the same slip of paper and holding it steady. "For my son, Christopher Schwarzenegger." The guard took the paper, eyes flicking over the print. His partner stood just behind, posture tense, waiting. A few guests in the nearby rows had turned their heads, sensing something was unfolding. Whispers began to ripple softly. "Wait, are they talking to him?" Someone murmured. "Isn't that?" Another voice asked, trailing off. The guard returned the paper, not quite meeting Arnold's eyes. "We've had some confusion with front row seating," he said. "We're just asking everyone without clear clearance to relocate." Arnold didn't take back the paper immediately. He looked at the man for a moment, then gently placed the slip back on his lap. "I've given you what you asked for. If there's confusion, it's not coming from me." The silence that followed was louder than anything spoken. A few seats down, an older woman's silver hair, upright posture, presence like someone who had raised generations, turned in her chair. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying a firmness honed by age and certainty. "That man is Arnold Schwarzenegger. Do you really think he needs to sneak into a high school graduation?" A few light chuckles broke the tension, not mocking, but supportive. One of the guards straightened up. The other tapped his earpiece, muttering into the mic. Arnold remained seated. He didn't smile, didn't nod. His eyes drifted forward, back toward the stage where the principal had begun speaking into the microphone, but around him, the air had changed. He wasn't being ignored anymore. He was being watched for all the wrong reasons. A teenage boy from the third row leaned toward his father. "Why are they bothering him? He's literally in the right seat." The father didn't answer, just shook his head slowly. A teacher near the aisle glanced toward the guards, then back at the podium. Her expression was tight, unsure. She wasn't going to get involved, but she didn't agree either. Arnold shifted only slightly, sitting taller. He didn't need to raise his voice. His presence did the speaking. The shorter guard tried again. "Sir, this really isn't a big deal. We just need to move you to a different row until we can." "It is a big deal," Arnold said quietly. "To my son." He said nothing else. That was enough. From behind, another voice spoke, not loud but clear. "Let him stay." Heads turned. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't protest. It was support, measured, certain. Another followed, then another. They didn't chant, they didn't argue. But the tide had shifted. The guards felt it. Their authority, once unquestioned, was now being weighed. And the man who sat quietly, refusing to be provoked, refusing to be removed, had already drawn his line. He wasn't here as a celebrity. He wasn't here to be recognized. He was here for one reason, and he was not going to miss his son's moment. The gym doors creaked open again, not loudly, but with just enough sound to draw the attention of those closest to the back. A soft breeze slipped in behind the movement, carrying with it a shift so subtle most didn't register it at first. But Arnold did. He didn't turn, he didn't move, he just knew. 5 men stepped inside. No uniforms, no badges. No fanfare, just simple buttoned-down shirts, clean slacks, boots that landed with quiet precision on the polished floor. They didn't speak, they didn't gesture, but their entrance was deliberate, each step measured, each glance purposeful. They paused near the entrance, eyes scanning the room, and then, almost without cue, they began to move. Not in a pack, but in formation, spreading through the outer aisles of the gym like a slow-moving current. Calm, present, unmistakable. One stopped near the far left bleachers. Broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, with the posture of a man who had once guarded the highest office in the state. Another leaned casually against a pillar near the emergency exit, his arms thick, tanned, bearing the kind of strength that wasn't for show. A third stood behind the third row, his stance familiar to anyone who had ever served in a firehouse, worn boots, sharp eyes, a quiet steadiness. The last 2 flanked opposite ends of the gym, positioned like anchors, watchful, steady, respectful. They didn't say Arnold's name, they didn't wave. They didn't need to. He had known they might come. None of them had to be asked. There was Dave, the former special agent who once ran security details during Arnold's time as governor. They hadn't spoken in a few months, but loyalty like his didn't expire. Then there was Rico, the powerlifter who trained with Arnold back in the Venice Beach days, big-hearted, bigger biceps, and a memory like steel when it came to those who had ever backed him. Alan, the firefighter from East LA, had once needed help when his daughter was diagnosed with leukemia. Arnold had made a phone call, covered the hospital costs, never spoke of it again. Alan never forgot. The other 2, Marcus and Nate, had been part of Arnold's after-school All-Stars program, not participants, leaders, mentors, men who had once stood beside him in rec centers, on playgrounds, in auditoriums packed with kids who needed more than a speech. They didn't just believe in what Arnold did, they had lived it. Now they were here, not as muscle, not to threaten, just to remind the room that no one stands alone forever, not if they've spent their life standing for others. The guards noticed. Of course they did. The younger one tapped his earpiece, voice lower now, unsure. The taller one shifted on his heels, glancing across the gym, then toward Arnold, who still hadn't moved, still seated, still quiet. But the presence had changed. What was once a man alone in a chair now felt like something else entirely, not a confrontation, not an entourage, something deeper, like a current had shifted underneath the floor. A few parents began to whisper again, not with concern, but with curiosity. One woman leaned to her husband. "Who are they?" she asked. He shrugged, eyes narrowed. "Friends, I'd guess." The principal on stage continued reading through the opening remarks, trying to maintain the flow, though his eyes flicked once toward the back of the gym. The tension wasn't hostile, but it was real. It hung in the space between action and stillness, between authority and presence. One of the volunteers at the side doors slipped out, returning moments later with a staff member wearing a headset and clipboard. She spoke quickly into her mic, nodded, then hurried off. Back near the main aisle, the shorter guard approached his supervisor, now standing halfway between the rows and the stage. Their exchange was brief, hushed, and left the supervisor scowling as he stepped away, pulling out his phone. Arnold's eyes didn't move, but he had seen it all. He knew the signs. It wasn't over. Someone had decided to escalate. Backstage, a call was being placed, not to event staff, not to school administration, to local law enforcement. Somewhere outside, officers were now on their way. Inside the gym, though no one had shouted, no one had been disrespectful, no laws broken, no scene made. Just 5 men standing quietly in different corners of a school gymnasium, bearing witness to something larger than themselves. And one man, silent, unshaken, waiting for his son's name to be called. The crowd didn't rise. But something inside them did. They may not have known all the details, but they understood the feeling. Respect, earned and unspoken, was now filling the room. And even though a new challenge was coming through the front gates, Arnold remained seated, surrounded not by noise, but by loyalty. By presence, by the kind of history that doesn't need to explain itself. He arrived without a word, walking with the clipped precision of someone used to being obeyed, not questioned. Black suit, earpiece coiled discreetly behind his right ear, a tablet held flat against his chest like a shield. The kind of man who didn't belong to the school faculty, but moved like he ran every detail behind the curtain. He paused just at the edge of the front row, a single step separating him from Arnold. He didn't crouch, he didn't smile, he just spoke. "Sir," he said, voice neutral but cold, "we've had some confusion with front row seating. These seats are designated for award recipients' families only. I'm going to need you to relocate." Arnold didn't move. His eyes lifted slowly, calm, focused, unimpressed. "I was given this seat by your own staff," he said, holding up the folded slip again, the one that had already made its rounds. "It's printed, it's confirmed, it's for my son." The man didn't even glance at it. "I understand, sir. But we have to enforce consistency. Exceptions make things harder for the rest of the team." Arnold's voice didn't rise, but it carried. "Then your consistency," he said, "is trying to take away the most important moment of a father's life." The man blinked just once. He wasn't expecting that tone, not aggressive, not desperate, just anchored, in something heavier than paper, in something not so easily moved. Guests nearby had turned again, their attention now shifting entirely from the stage to this quiet confrontation. A few phones tilted slightly, not to record, but to snap a photo. One man in the second row narrowed his eyes, murmured to his wife, "This is absurd." The staffer with the earpiece shifted, tried again. "Sir, I'm sure you understand we have to follow the plan. This section is tightly controlled. Please don't make this difficult." "I'm not making anything difficult," Arnold replied. "I came to support my son. I followed your process. I showed my credentials, and now you're turning that into a problem." Before the staffer could respond, a voice came from behind. Older, worn, steady. "This isn't about seats anymore." Heads turned. It was the same silver-haired woman from earlier, the one who had recognized Arnold for who he was, not as a celebrity, but as a father. She sat upright, arms folded, eyes sharp beneath her glasses. "This is about principle," she said. "This man has done nothing wrong, and yet you keep pushing." The staffer looked at her, then around, registering the growing stares. The subtle tension now had weight, not from noise, but from presence. The principal's voice echoed faintly through the gym, continuing the ceremony from the stage. But here, on the ground, something else was unfolding. Arnold didn't stand. He didn't raise his voice, he just held the silence. The staffer touched his earpiece again, murmured into it, then stepped back. He didn't say goodbye, didn't offer thanks. Just turned and walked swiftly back toward the side doors, tablet still pressed to his chest. Arnold breathed in, slow and steady, but he knew what that move meant. Someone had given an order, not from the crowd, not from the school, from somewhere else. A few moments later, the gym doors opened again. This time, there was no ambiguity. Two uniformed police officers stepped inside. Their presence didn't startle the room, it silenced it. Like a sudden drop in temperature, no one moved, no one spoke. Arnold didn't look at them, not yet. He kept his eyes on the stage, where Christopher still waited behind a line of students, one hand resting calmly on the tassel of his cap. He hadn't seen the officers yet, but Arnold had. And in that stillness, in the heart of the noise, a quiet truth settled over the gym. This wasn't over, but it had already gone too far. The officers moved with calm professionalism, their steps echoing softly as they entered the gym. The first was tall, lean, with a badge that read Ramirez. The second, stockier, followed just behind, scanning the rows as if searching for something or someone. Heads turned, conversations ceased. The weight of their presence wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. No sirens, no shouting, but a shift in the room, immediate and sharp. This was no longer just a ceremony, it had become something else. Arnold remained seated. He didn't turn, he didn't flinch. His hands stayed folded in his lap. His eyes were fixed on the stage, on the line of graduates still waiting to walk. Christopher stood 3 students from the podium now. His posture was strong, but his gaze had drifted. He had seen the uniforms. The lead officer, Ramirez, approached quietly, no arrogance, no assumptions, just duty. He leaned down, his voice low, measured. "Sir," he said, "we've been asked to verify your placement here. Would you mind showing us your seating assignment?" Arnold reached into his coat pocket, slow and steady. No urgency, no resistance. He unfolded the same slip of paper. Held it out, Ramirez took it. He read it, once, then again. The officer looked at the name, then at the man sitting before him. A moment passed. Recognition dawned, not in a rush, but in something deeper. Respect, understanding. He nodded. "This is valid," Ramirez said, straightening. "He's where he's supposed to be." The room held its breath, and then it broke, not in cheers, not in chants, but in applause, soft at first from somewhere in the back. Then others joined, row by row. No one clapped for a celebrity, no one clapped for power. They clapped because right had been defended, quietly, with dignity. The tension cracked, like glass under steady pressure, and in its place something clearer emerged, a collective release. A shared truth. Arnold didn't acknowledge the clapping, he didn't nod or wave, he simply sat, unmoved. The second officer gave Ramirez a look, questioning, unsure. Ramirez offered a slight shake of the head, nothing more to do here. They turned and stepped away, moving to the side of the gym, where they remained, silent observers now. At the far end of the student line, Christopher watched it all, every word, every step. His expression didn't change. But in his eyes, something shifted. Not surprise, not concern, pride. He had seen what many hadn't. A father, unshaken under pressure, not for his name, but for the right to be present. The principal continued with the ceremony, voice steady as names were called, diplomas handed out. The rhythm returned. But something had changed in the room. Arnold adjusted slightly in his seat, not to relax, but to settle deeper into the moment. He looked at the stage, at his son, and for the first time that morning, he allowed himself to exhale. Not in triumph, in confirmation. He had stayed, and he would see it through. The principal returned to the microphone with a slight smile, the ceremony moving into its final moments. "And now," he said, "it is my honor to introduce this year's valedictorian, Christopher Schwarzenegger." The spotlight shifted. Christopher stepped forward. He moved with quiet control, not hurried, not hesitant. The weight of the ceremony hadn't touched his shoulders, but something else had. He reached the podium and paused, looking out at the room. The gym was silent again, not the silence of tension, the silence of listening. He adjusted the microphone, his fingers steady. I want to begin by thanking the teachers, the staff, and everyone who worked to make today happen, he said. To my classmates, thank you for growing alongside me. To my mother, thank you for your strength, your patience, and your belief in me. A few heads turned toward the front row. Christopher's eyes didn't move. Not yet. He took a breath. But there's one more person I want to thank. The room stilled again. Someone who taught me that doing the right thing isn't always easy, that sometimes it makes you stand alone. Sometimes it even makes people question your presence, your purpose, your right to belong. He paused, letting the words settle. But he also taught me that when that happens, you don't step back. You don't explain yourself to people who won't listen. You just stand still, and you let your integrity speak for you. He looked toward the front row, toward Arnold. I want to thank my father. No gasp, no applause yet, just a beat of silence so full it echoed. For showing me, Christopher continued, that strength isn't volume. It's consistency. It's knowing who you are, especially when the world forgets. The room reacted not with clapping at first, but with stillness. A collective breath held between two generations. Arnold didn't rise, he didn't nod. But his eyes met his son's, and in that quiet look, something passed between them, not pride alone, recognition, understanding, legacy. Christopher's shoulders remained squared, his voice steady. And because of him, he said, I know what kind of man I want to be, and where I want to go. He didn't elaborate, but a few in the room understood what he meant. Not just college, service, future. Applause came then, not loud, not rushed, but layered, genuine. Christopher stepped back from the microphone and returned to his place in the line, his steps still even. As he passed the front row, he didn't break stride, but his eyes found Arnold one last time. No smile, just a shared truth, and that was enough. The sun had begun to slide behind the horizon, casting long golden streaks across the lawn as families spilled out of the gym. Laughter mixed with camera shutters, hugs, and voices calling names across the crowd. Caps lay forgotten in the grass. Balloons drifted skyward, free at last from proud hands. The celebration had resumed, but not for everyone. Arnold stood off to the side beneath a tall oak tree near the edge of the parking lot. Christopher walked beside him. The moment was quiet now, no eyes on them, no questions, just the weight of what had been said and what had been earned. They didn't speak right away. Then Christopher glanced over, his voice was low. Today, I didn't just learn something, I lived it. Arnold didn't respond right away. He watched a group of students pile into a minivan. A father lifted a girl in his arms and spun her in a circle. A teacher waved goodbye to a cluster of boys heading for the far lot. Then Arnold turned to his son. Being who you are, he said, won't always earn you applause, or even acceptance, but you have to stay rooted anyway, especially when it's uncomfortable. Christopher nodded. He didn't blink, he understood. They reached the truck. It was the same one Arnold had driven that morning. No decals, no cameras. Just steel and silence. He opened the door for Christopher, who stepped in without a word. Arnold walked around the front and slid behind the wheel. His hands rested on the steering wheel, but he didn't start the engine just yet. Behind them, another vehicle pulled up, an old black SUV, windows tinted. It didn't honk, didn't flash its lights, it just waited. Inside, a man sat in the driver's seat, weathered, calm, watching. It was Creed. The same man who had stood behind Arnold decades ago, when thousands had marched through downtown Los Angeles, demanding justice, and the world had asked if he was standing in the wrong place. He hadn't been then, and he wasn't now. From the rearview mirror, Arnold caught a glimpse of Creed's face. The same calm nod, the same quiet loyalty. Arnold didn't smile. He simply put the truck in gear and pulled out, slowly, the crunch of gravel beneath the tires, the only sound between father and son. They didn't look back at the gym, not because it didn't matter, but because what mattered had already happened. Christopher looked out the window, then down at the program in his lap, then at his father. You stood your ground, he said, even when they tried to move you. Arnold kept his eyes on the road. I wasn't standing for myself, he said. Christopher looked forward again. No, he replied, but you taught me how. The sun dipped lower, throwing the final edge of orange light across the road as they drove west. 2 generations, one message: you don't have to be loud to be strong, you just have to stay still when it matters most. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.